Hey, I'm Mead. I'm in the studio today and I'm going to draw a skull for you. Break it down into simple shapes, show you some little line work options, keep the value pretty simple, keep the rendering to a minimum, and hopefully you'll enjoy this tutorial. If you want to learn more, you can always check out more videos on the channel, and I'll be releasing some full courses soon with a lot of examples and real-time demos as well. So, hope you enjoy.
Here we go. We're going to break this down into simple shapes first. And when I'm drawing digitally, I usually do this by tracing. Just throw the reference over. And, I think simple things like circles, spheres, triangles, um, cones, things like that. Your three basic shapes always are going to be your circle, triangle, rectangle. And then I like to, when I'm doing anything related to life drawing, I like to find three concepts. One is the contour, which we've already done. The second is the center, and the third is the corner. So the corner is the toughest thing to find, I think, um, because it's soft and curved. But I try to do that every time. Then from there, I like to do another analysis of just breaking down into some more sub shapes, I guess you would call it. Still simple, but a little more complicated than just, triangle and circle. Um, and then I put the reference to the side and I like to freehand sketch because I don't like to trace over that much unless I really have to for something, like if I'm drawing an advertisement and have to draw a car, like definitely going to trace the car, right? Because it needs to be exact. And here, this first layer is really simplified. I use heavier line weight, darker lines. There's a lot of searching lines. I just basically make a mess of this whole drawing, and I try to get close, right? It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be exact. And I try to use some of the tools from the analysis sketch and tracing that I did and bring those forward. If I notice anything glaring, I'll fix it now. Otherwise, I'll fix it on subsequent layers. So the nice thing about working digitally is you can always make these changes really quickly. But when you're working analog, you can do the same thing. You can use pencils to lay these out, or you can use cool gray 10% markers, and it looks pretty much just like this. So once we have that initial layer done, then I want to come back and do a clean line layer each time, and still thinking simple shapes. I keep those next to me when I draw a lot of the time. You know, the ellipse or circle, the triangle, and the rectangle. And what I look for is each one of these shapes, though it's organic and more complicated, has a tendency to fit towards one or the other of those. And so that's what I look for. The nose is kind of elliptical. It's got little points like a triangle, or at least the hole. The eyes actually are more square than most people usually make them. Whenever I look at a skull and I look at these eye sockets, I don't see round eyeball shaped sockets. I see sort of boxy protective mechanisms where the eyeball would fit into. Um, and I always look for the most basic shapes first. But really, you can start anywhere. If your initial sketch is kind of close, then you can rely on that as sort of the framework for the drawing up here. Um, One of the things that I always check for, and because I make this mistake and everybody makes this mistake all the time, is the far side of the face or the skull. That usually gets too big. So I'm almost always trying to adjust the space between the nose and the far edge and make that as small as I can, or as small as is realistically possible. Because usually the tendency is to make that side wider than it should. And if you can get that far side nailed down, then that's really what's going to make your drawings look much, much better. Um, and here, as I go through, you're not just observing this for the first time. This is actually the third, maybe the fourth time that you've looked at this skull. So by this point, you should be keying into some smaller details and some of the smaller shapes and adding those in and making changes to the larger shapes as you see them. So that's what I'm always looking for by this stage in the line work. So this is really the third whole time that I've gone over the whole thing. Um, so I'm looking to make these adjustments and make these little changes. Some stuff is right, other stuff is wrong, but that's okay. Then usually I try to ground these things, put some kind of background in, And then the first thing that I do um, is put a tone over the whole thing. Now, working digitally, for me, I like to do the lasso bucket method where you use the lasso, create a big shape, and bucket fill it with a value. At this point, the value doesn't really matter. I usually just use like 50% gray. Um, and then I'll put a couple of different values in the background. Again, doesn't really matter too much what they are, just that they're there. And then I'll throw a gradient layer just on top of the skull to get a quick idea of light. Um, Usually when I'm blocking in shadows, well, usually I start by blocking in shadows, right? I'll pick something just darker than the base tone, not even like the darkest tone. It doesn't really matter as long as it's darker because all you're trying to do at this stage is just like differentiate the dark from the light side. That's all. And you need any tone that is just darker than that to begin with. You can always go back and add more layers later, and of course we're going to do that. So now we're going down to like the 75% dark, and we'll start filling in some of these areas and looking at our reference really closely just to see like where these big impacts are. One of the things that I like to do is I like to make references really small or squint so I can see like the overall effect that the value has. And you could tell that most of the light values are basically on the upper part of the skull from the teeth upwards. And everything else is kind of dark. There's little highlights here and there and little areas where light pokes out. You can see there's a lot of shadow on the side too in the reference. And we're going to try to pull that together as we develop this whole thing. Um, Now going through here, I also like to anchor a few places. I call these anchors. Basically, I like to find where the darkest parts are, like where there's no light getting to them, especially on the object. If it's something like a skull, there are these places that are just total absence of light, and I like to make those really dark. And at first, it looks a little weird because it doesn't really integrate that well, um, but it comes together in the end. And then I like to also do the opposite, where I'll go and I'll anchor the lightest part. So I'll find like the brightest highlights after I find the darkest darks, and then I'll have established my full value range that way. And by value, we basically just mean shading, right? How light or dark something is. Um, and between those two anchors, that's where you start working, right? So you anchor your darkest dark, your lightest light, and that establishes like your top and bottom. Um, and your darkest dark and darkest light are like a matter of choice, right? Like you could have your lightest light be about 90% and your darkest dark be about 10%, right? You can use a restricted value range if you want. Again, it doesn't really matter what it is, just that you're clear on your decisions about that, right? And here, um, I like to think about this sort of thing as like working within a lot of midtones. So I want to darken that side of the skull. I want to get the feel that there's not a lot of light on that side so that the front really looks like it's the front. Again, going back to that concept of finding the corner, because if you find the corner, you find the front and you find the side, and that's really important. Um, I also like to find any little imperfections and distinctive indentations that create a big value shift. And again, I also want to work from like big to small if I can. Sometimes I break that rule. Everybody kind of does. Now we're getting to some of like the small shapes that are really distinctive, like getting the shadow in between each tooth, right? And those little small things. So I'll switch to like a smaller, more drawing oriented brush rather than like a broad value depositing brush to do this sort of work um, so that things kind of get established. Then I never want to forget that I need to ground my objects. I don't want a floating skull, I want a grounded skull. So I'll add another layer and put a ground shadow on. And usually I'll use very large brushes. You could do this with the gradient tool as well. But I like to brush it out because it's got more nuance that way, a little more texture, and it feels more like drawing, honestly. um, Now we're in the point where everything's established, and so from here on out, it's pretty much refinement, right? So we've used really basic shapes to lay this out. So we think basically we've got, blunt layout shapes. We've got our front, we've got our bottom, and we've got our side of the skull, right? We got our jaw and we got the upper part of the cranium. Um, and now we're thinking, okay, well, we got all these big things established. So let's go through the line one more time. Just get that real refined. So this is, again, another chance to reobserve and to play around with where you want to pick up line, how dark it is, how thick it is, and if you need to make any particular changes, you can make them again now. We're pretty sure we're locked onto the shape, but we can always make changes to the overall shape too. Um, and we can just continue refining, continue pushing values, adding more details, and adding um, more of the structure, right? So we didn't have the structure that encompasses the roots of each tooth, so we're adding those little substructures. Um, Adding some key details like cracks within the teeth, right? Looking for anything that's particularly distinctive about this skull, right? Um, and by distinctive, I mean unique to the skull and that adds some character, but doesn't distract from the overall feel. Like we don't want to do anything that distracts from what we've done already. What we're trying to get balance is the idea of a large visual impact from big shapes and the rewarding detail when you look close. So that's always a matter of experience and aesthetic choices that you make. And by doing this and playing around with it, you'll get a basic understanding of how this works and what you can kind of eliminate. Like for instance, I didn't put a lot of detail in those lower teeth because they're in shadow and I can lose information in the shadow. It's no big deal. Um, and I don't have to like kind of render out the form of each tooth when the teeth are in shadow and they're not really part of the focus. I know that the focal point is going to be the teeth in this piece because it's so clear. There's a lot of contrast there. There's a lot of detail there. Um, and that S curve of the mouth just really is kind of appealing to me as a shape. The other thing that I want to do is be sure that I handle edges. One of the things about digital work that I think often goes ignored is how you treat your edges. And if you can get a good concept of edge handling in both analog and digital work, really, um, you'll up the level of sophistication of your pieces a huge amount. And here we're doing drawing and line-based work, but even that applies to painting too. If you want to paint really well, you need to handle your edges really well. And I'm always striving to do that myself, and I'm always learning how to do it better because um, it's something that can always be improved. Um, and usually we want a little bit of line. Um, on the back to just hold that back edge a little bit to make sure that it like the drawing itself just really holds together and coheres. Um, Lines that are heavy and dark usually pull forward, but we do need lines in the back to kind of make make this all work too. One of the adjustments that I saw and kind of needed to make here is I wanted to go through and really get the subtle shading around the mouth and get some of those lines that I put down a little bit more blended. And here I'm kind of skipping around a little bit. Usually in the early stages, I work a little more systematically. I also zoom in and out just to check whether anything's bothering me, get a different sort of view on the piece, um, and keep zooming out, zooming in, just to see how the overall impact works versus how the detail works. And this is what we call kind of like the nitpicking process, of where we're just pushing values down, pulling values up, making sure that everything is defined the way we need it to be defined, making sure that any overall contrast we need to have is high enough. So one thing I noticed was that the eyes just hadn't gotten dark enough, and there was a little bit of a halo around that edge where it got too light. So I need to come back through and push those eyes down dark enough um, so that it really works. We still want to get the idea that there's like reflected light bouncing around in there, so it's not going to be just a perfectly flat dark shape. But we do need to go in there and really darken that up. Um, I also take the time to look for shadow cores at this point and make sure that um, that the shadow cores are really distinctive. Shadow cores help you show corners of the forms, and that's kind of one of our main core concepts that we're always going to be working with. And here, I just needed to adjust the outer contour around that tooth because it had gotten a little oversimplified. And then these are kind of the last finishing touches before we call it good here. And there we go, one complete skull for you. Thank you for watching, and I appreciate it.